So, look, I'm going to tell you about my dog first, because none of the rest of this makes any sense without him. Boone. Walker Coonhound and Plothound mix, mostly Plot, with the brindle and the heavy chest and the head shaped like he was built to push through brush. 85 pounds in his prime. The vet over in Ishpeming told me when I got him that I'd be lucky to keep him 10 years. He made it to 14 and a half, bone cancer at the end, in the spine, and I held him on the kitchen floor on March 17th, 2024, while the snow was still in the yard because the Upper Peninsula doesn't let go of winter until late May some years. I buried him under the white pine at the south edge of the property, because that's where he liked to lie in summer, watching the field down to the tree line. I'm telling you about Boone because Boone is the reason nothing bad happened to me out here for 22 years. I didn't understand that until April. By April, something was already on the porch. Let me back up because if I just tell you about April, you'll think I'm crazy and you'll have every right to. I'm 63 years old. I bought the place outside Republic in the spring of 2002 after my wife passed from an aneurysm at 41 and I couldn't stand to live in the house in Wyandotte anymore. Republic is a town in Marquette County most people couldn't find on a map. Population a little under 600, used to be 10 times that when the iron was still coming out of the ground. The property is 80 acres, cleared field of about 12, the rest is mixed hardwood and pine, and the back of it runs into state forest that doesn't really stop until you hit the McCormick Wilderness north of here, and past that the Huron Mountains, and past that just trees and water and rock all the way up to Lake Superior. It is deep country. You can drive 40 minutes from my driveway and not see another vehicle. There are black bear here. There are timber wolves. There are lynx that the DNR will tell you about, and cougars that the DNR will tell you are not here, even when you show them the tracks. The DNR has its own version of what lives in these woods, and the real version is something else. I think that's worth saying up front because it'll come up later. Boone came with the property in a way. The previous owner, an old retired pulp cutter named Earl Lottie, had a litter of pups in the barn when I came up to look at the place. Walker Mama, Plot Daddy from somewhere down toward Iron Mountain. Earl was moving in with his daughter in Green Bay and couldn't take them. I picked the biggest one out, the one with the white blaze on his chest who wouldn't quit looking at me, and Earl just handed him over, said something about how a place out here needs a dog. I thought he meant for company. I was wrong about what he meant, but I didn't know that for 10 more years. The first decade with Boone was just life, normal life. I built the workshop out of the barn. I learned how to put up enough firewood for a UP winter. I learned which months the black flies would eat you alive and which months you could sit on the porch without a head net. Boone learned the property, and the property learned him. He'd run the line of the field every morning, the way some dogs run the same loop in the yard, except his loop was about 1.5 miles, and he never got bored of it. We'd see bear sign in the back 40. He'd tree squirrels. He'd swim in the creek that runs through the northwest corner. Normal. Then, sometime in 2013, I think it was August, Boone started doing the thing. I want to be careful about how I describe this because it's the foundation of everything. The thing was very specific. It only happened maybe 12 times a year, but it always happened the same way. We'd be in the yard at the gold hour, that long slanted light you get up here in late summer when the mosquitoes are thinning and the light is the color of cold beer held up to the window. Boone would freeze. Not the way he froze when he scented a grouse. That was a different freeze. That was head up, body forward, weight on the front legs. This was the opposite. Head down, hackles up along his spine and a ridge from his neck all the way to his tail, lips peeled back slow from his teeth. And the thing that scared me the most the first time he did it was that he didn't bark. Boone barked at everything. He barked at the mailman. He barked at falling leaves. He barked at his own reflection in the wood stove glass. But when he did this thing, the only sound he made was a low rumble in his chest that you felt in the floorboards through your boots more than you heard with your ears. He stared at the tree line. South edge, where the field meets the state forest. He stared like he was reading something out there, like he and whatever was in the trees were carrying on a conversation I couldn't hear. The first time it happened, I tried to walk toward the tree line to see what he was looking at. Boone got in front of me, pressed his whole shoulder into my thigh, pushed me back toward the house. I'd never seen him do that in my life. He had no herding dog in him, but he was herding me, away from the trees toward the porch, and when I tried to step around him, he moved to block me, and his head was still down, and his eyes never left the tree line. I let him push me back to the porch, and we stood there together, and we watched the trees. And after maybe 6 or 7 minutes, Boone's hackles dropped all at once, and his lips came back over his teeth, and he sat down next to me and panted and looked up at me with that loose-tongued, happy look like nothing had just happened. The next morning, I went out to the tree line to look. There were tracks, 4 toes, not 5 like a bear. Not 4 toes plus a heel pad arranged the way a canid's foot is arranged. 4 long toes with claws, and behind them a pad, and the whole print was around 9 inches from the back of the pad to the tip of the lead claw. Bigger than any wolf print I have ever seen, and I have seen wolf prints. The stride was the part that didn't add up. The distance from one footfall to the next, left to right, was about 8 feet. 8 feet between strides. I'm 6'2". My walking stride is around 30 inches. A racing greyhound at full sprint stretches maybe 10 feet. This was a walking gait. Whatever made the tracks was walking when it left them, and it had legs that allowed it to cover 8 feet at a stroll. The track also wasn't shaped right for any quadruped. The toes were arranged like fingers, long, splayed. A wolf's toes are bunched. A bear's are flatter and wider. These were the toes of something that gripped, something that climbed, or something that pulled. I followed them maybe 50 yards back into the brush, and they vanished at a downed cedar, like the thing had stepped up onto the trunk and stayed up there. I looked up into the canopy. I didn't see anything. I went back to the house. I told myself it was a bear standing on its hind legs that had walked along the tree line for some bear reason. Bears do strange things. Then I thought about it for an hour, and I admitted to myself that it wasn't a bear. I didn't have a better answer than that. I just knew what it wasn't. I called the DNR field office in Marquette, and a woman named Joyce took down the description and was very polite and said she'd pass it along. Nobody ever called me back. I'm not blaming Joyce. That's just how those calls go. Over the next 11 years, the same thing kept happening. Boone would freeze, hackles up, tree line, low growl. Some part of the year, it was once a month. Some part of the year, not at all. Always at dusk. Almost always at the south edge of the field. Occasionally at the east edge, where the property runs along an old logging 2-track. I learned to recognize the moment. I'd be drinking coffee on the porch, and Boone would go still beside me, and the coffee in my hand would suddenly seem far away and unimportant, and I would just sit there until he relaxed. I never saw what was in the trees, not in 11 years. I'd see tracks the next morning sometimes. I'd hear, late at night, maybe twice a year, a kind of vocalization that came from a long way off, and that I could never place. It wasn't a wolf howl. I know what a wolf howl sounds like. There's a pack that runs the McCormick about 4 miles north of here, and they sing about once a week in the warm months, and the sound is one of the most beautiful and lonely things in the world. This was something else, lower, shorter, more like a long syllable than a song. It would come from the north, deep in the state forest, and I'd hear it through the wall of the bedroom around 2 in the morning, and Boone, asleep at the foot of the bed, would lift his head and listen, and then put his head back down. He was never afraid of it. That's the part I want you to understand. Boone was never afraid. He was on duty. There's a difference. There was one night in particular I want to tell you about, because it's the one I keep coming back to when I think about the 11 years. It was February of 2019. We had a stretch of cold come down out of Canada that winter. 3 days of -20 and a wind you could feel in your teeth when you stepped outside. The thermometer on the side of the porch read -26. The night I'm thinking of. The kind of cold that kills people who don't respect it. I was inside making chili. Boone was on his bed by the wood stove. The wind was knocking the loose siding on the shed, and I had the radio on low, an ironwood station playing old country, Merle Haggard, that kind of thing. Around 10 at night, Boone got up off his bed and walked to the door and stood there. He didn't ask to go out. He just stood at the door and looked at it. His tail was down. His ears were back. I let him out, because that's what you do when a dog asks. He went out and stood on the porch, and he didn't go down the steps. He stood there in the -26 air, and he looked south toward the tree line. I put my coat on and went out with him. The field was full of moonlight. We were 3 days past the full moon. The snow was up over my knees out in the open, and the wind had carved drifts that looked like waves of a frozen sea. The trees at the south edge of the property were black against the white. The moon was so bright I could see them clear. And at the tree line, at the edge of the trees where the snow met the dark, there was a shape, I want to tell you what I saw, and I want to tell you that I am sure of what I saw, because the conditions were as good as they were ever going to be for seeing something at the edge of my field. Full moon, clear sky, snow on the ground reflecting the moonlight. -26 air that doesn't carry the kind of haze warmer air does. I had my distance glasses on, and I had been outside for 30 seconds, long enough for my eyes to adjust. I saw it. It was tall, taller than I am, and I am 6'2", and there was a foot of snow under it. It stood upright. Its shoulders were broader than a man's by maybe half. Its head was wrong. The head was the part I couldn't make sense of then, and that I can make sense of now, in light of what Voss told me. The head was canine in shape, a long muzzle, ears that came up to points. The proportions of the head fit a wolf or a dog, but the body underneath the head fit a man with broader shoulders. It was watching the cabin. It did not move while I watched it. Boone, beside me on the porch, did the thing he always did. Low head, hackles up. The rumble in his chest that I felt in the porch boards through my insulated boots. He did not bark. I do not know how long the three of us stood there. The thing at the tree line, and Boone, and me. The cold was eating through my coat, and my eyes were watering from the wind, and I could not look away. Then the thing did something. It raised one arm, not a paw, an arm. It raised one arm, and it placed the hand of that arm on the trunk of the pine next to it. Just placed it. Like a man resting his hand on a doorframe. Then it lowered the arm and turned and walked back into the trees. Boone's hackles dropped. He looked up at me, and I swear to you he looked relieved, the way a soldier looks relieved when a long shift ends, and he went back into the cabin and got on his bed by the wood stove and slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I went out to the tree line. The cold had not let up. There were tracks in the snow at the spot where I had seen it standing. 4 toes, the pad behind. The stride going back into the trees was 9 feet that night, longer than usual, maybe because the deep snow forced it to step bigger. The pine where it had placed its hand had 4 parallel scratches in the bark at about 8 feet up. The scratches were not random. They were spaced like fingers. I have thought about that night 1,000 times. The hand on the tree. It was something between a wave and a salute. It was a being that knew it was being observed, acknowledging the observer. It was, in the moment, the closest thing to a greeting I had ever received from anything in those woods. And Boone had stood next to me through all of it and not made a sound louder than a rumble, and the rumble had been the right amount of presence to keep the thing where it was. That is what dogs like Boone do. They calibrate. They know exactly how much weight to put on the situation. They don't escalate. They don't back down. They hold the line at the temperature the line needs to be at. Around 2017, I started talking to a few of the year-round neighbors about it. Henrik Sari, who has a place about a mile east of mine, an old Finnish guy whose grandfather built a cabin in 1926, listened to me for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You got a dog, yeah?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Keep that dog alive as long as you can." He didn't elaborate. I asked him what he meant. He just said it again. "Keep the dog alive." Then he changed the subject to the price of propane. Henrik's dog at the time was an old chocolate lab named Sisu. Sisu was 13 and going gray around the muzzle and slept in front of the wood stove most of the day. I didn't think anything more about it for a long time. There was a guy who used to have a cabin about 3 miles up the road from me, off the same county route. I never knew him well. Roger something. I'd see him at the gas station in Republic now and then. He was up here from Detroit, weekender, kept the cabin for hunting. Roger didn't have a dog. In the winter of 1996, 6 years before I bought my place, Roger went up to his cabin alone for a long weekend and never came back. His wife reported him missing on a Tuesday. The sheriff went out. The cabin was open. The wood stove was cold. Roger's truck was in the driveway. His rifle was in the cabinet. No sign of struggle. No footprints in fresh snow that led anywhere useful. They searched for 2 weeks and never found him. He's still listed as missing, as of this conversation. I learned about Roger from Henrik in the same conversation where Henrik told me to keep Boone alive. Henrik said it like the two things were connected. I didn't ask him to explain because I didn't really want to know. I did meet Roger once. I want to put that in here because it has come back to me a lot since Henrik told me his name. It was the fall of 1995, the year before he disappeared. I had no idea then I would ever live up here. I was working for a contractor out of Marquette who had brought me up for a 4-week job, redoing roofs at a Methodist camp out by Lake Michigamme. I had stopped at the gas station in Republic on my way back south one Friday evening. Roger was standing at the counter, paying for a gallon of milk and a pack of cigarettes. I remember him because of the way he was standing. He had his back to the door, but his shoulders were tight, and his head was angled like he was listening for something behind him. I came in, and the bell on the door jingled, and Roger spun around so fast he knocked the milk off the counter. I picked it up and handed it back to him. He had a face like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. He thanked me. His hand was shaking when he took the milk. He paid. He left. I watched him through the window, get into a maroon Bronco, and sit in the driver's seat for maybe a full minute before he turned the key. Just sat there staring at the gas pump. I asked the cashier about him after he drove away. She was an older woman, brown perm, name tag that said Linda. She said, "That's Roger from Detroit. Got a cabin up the route. He's not himself. He says he hears things at the cabin. I told him he ought to bring up a dog. He said he was thinking about it. I didn't think anything of it then. I had a soda and drove the 4 hours back to Wyandotte and forgot about Roger and his Bronco and Linda's brown perm. 6 years later, I bought my place. I came up to look at the property in April of 2002. I sat in the kitchen with Earl Lottie, and the puppies were tumbling around our feet, and Earl said, "The thing about how a place out here needs a dog," and somewhere in the back of my head, very faint, I heard a man in a flannel shirt in a gas station telling a cashier with a brown perm that he was thinking about getting a dog. I didn't make the connection then. I have made it since. The thinking about it doesn't help. You have to actually do it. You have to bring the dog home. The dog has to live with you long enough to know the property. The arrangement has to be made. Roger never made it. He thought about it, and he went up to his cabin alone that February, and he didn't come back. That's the texture of the first decade with the thing in the trees. Boone on duty, the tree line humming on certain evenings, sounds in the dark, tracks in the morning, stories from neighbors that didn't quite land but that you didn't shake off. I built my life around it without ever calling it what it was, because if you call it what it is, you have to do something about it, and I didn't have anything to do about it. So I had a dog, and I had a property, and I had a routine, and I had a low constant hum of awareness in the back of my head that ran underneath everything else. And for 11 years, it stayed exactly there. A hum, not a roar. Then Boone got old. The cancer started in his lower back. The vet in Ishpeming, a woman named Dr. Bertelson, who treated him from puppy on, found it in November of last year. She showed me the films. She told me how it was going to go. She said we could do palliative if I wanted. But he was 14, and he was tired, and the kindest thing was to keep him comfortable and let him tell me when he was done. He was always going to tell me. That was the kind of dog he was. He told me on the morning of March 17th. He'd stopped eating 3 days before. He dragged himself out to his spot under the white pine that morning in the snow and lay down. And when I went out to bring him in, he looked up at me and his eyes were already going dim, and I knew. I called Dr. Bertelson, and she drove out in her own truck, and we did it on the kitchen floor on a wool blanket. I held him. He didn't fight it. He took one long breath, and then he didn't take another. The whole house went very, very quiet. I dug the grave that afternoon. The ground was still frozen in the top 8 inches, and I had to use the pickaxe through the crust. But below that, it was soft enough. I went down 4 feet. I wrapped him in his blanket and laid him in, and I filled the hole back up, and I marked it with a flat stone I'd pulled out of the creek years ago, because Boone used to like to lie on it in summer. That night, the house was quieter than I have heard a house in my life. For the first 2 weeks, I just moved through the days. I made coffee. I split the last of the winter wood. I watched the snow recede off the south-facing slope of the field. I didn't think about the tree line. I didn't think about what Henrik had said. I was thinking about my dog. On the morning of April 2nd, I came out onto the porch with my coffee at around 6:15, and I almost stepped on it. There was a print on the porch, not on the boards leading up to the porch, on the porch itself, right in front of the door, one single print, damp, like whatever made it, had stepped in the wet grass first and then up onto the boards. 4 toes, the pad behind. About 9 inches from the back of the pad to the tip of the lead claw. Bigger than any wolf print I have ever seen, but I have seen this print before. I have seen this print for 11 years out at the tree line, 80 yards from where I was standing. It had come up onto the porch. I stood there with my coffee cooling in my hand, and I felt the temperature of the morning change. It was 36 degrees out and clear, and there was nothing wrong with the air, but I felt cold in a way that wasn't about the air. I walked the length of the porch. There was only one print. The thing had stepped up onto the porch with one foot, set it down in front of my door, and then either stepped back off the way it had come or stepped over me, because there wasn't a second print anywhere. I went back inside, I put the coffee down, I sat at the kitchen table and I tried to think. I went and got Boone's collar off the hook by the door. I just held it. The leather was worn smooth where his neck had pressed on it. The tags clinked. I sat there and I held the collar and I thought about what Henrik had said in 2017. Keep that dog alive. I tried to tell myself the print was old, that it had been there for weeks under the snow and the thaw had revealed it. I went back out and checked. The print was wet. The dew on the porch around it was undisturbed except where the print sat. It had been made within the last few hours. I checked the tree line through the binoculars. Nothing. That whole day I didn't go far from the house. I told myself I wasn't avoiding the field. I was just doing inside things. Bills, laundry. I rearranged the spice rack. I avoided looking at the tree line through the kitchen window, and I noticed I was avoiding it, and I made myself look at it. And there was nothing there. Just the trees standing the way trees stand. That night, I left the porch light on for the first time in 22 years. I have never been a porch light kind of person. Up here, you don't put a porch light on at night because it just attracts moths and gives every creature in a square mile a way to find your house. But I left it on that night. I went to bed around 11. I lay in the dark and listened. Around 2:15 I heard it, not far away. Maybe at the edge of the field. The vocalization. Closer than I'd ever heard it. It was a long, low syllable. Almost a word. The closest I can get is to say that if you take the sound of a man clearing his throat and you stretch it out for 4 seconds and you drop it 2 octaves below where a human throat can go, you'd have something in the neighborhood. There was a quality to it that I want to call breath, a wet quality. The sound of something with a throat and lungs and a wet mouth making a sound on purpose. It was not a howl. It was not a call to anything else. It was directed. I lay in the bed in the dark, and I felt the sound in my sternum and the backs of my teeth. And Boone wasn't at the foot of the bed, where he had been for 14.5 years, and the loneliness of that was its own kind of cold. In the morning, there were tracks under the bedroom window, 3 of them this time, coming up to the wall under the window, stopping there, then leading back across the yard, across the field, back to the tree line. The tracks coming were 1 stride apart, around 8 feet. The tracks going were the same. Whatever had been there had walked up to my window slow, stood at it for some length of time, and walked away. I sat down in the wet grass next to the prints. I don't remember sitting down. I just remember being there. That was the morning I called Henrik. Henrik Sari is 78 now. His wife Maria passed in 2021. He lives alone in the cabin his grandfather built. He doesn't have email. He has a landline that works most of the time, depending on the weather. I called him from the kitchen at 8 in the morning, still in my barn coat from sitting in the grass. He picked up on the 3rd ring. I said, "Henrik, it's me." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Boone died in March." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I heard." I told him about the print on the porch and the prints under the window, and the sound at 2:15. I told him I was sitting in the kitchen with my coffee and I didn't know what to do. He listened all the way through. He didn't interrupt. When I was done, he was quiet for a long time on his end of the line. I could hear his old refrigerator running in the background of his kitchen. Finally, he said, "Sisu died in 2016. I knew that. I had been there at the wake. Henrik's family in the UP does wakes for dogs the way some families do them for grandparents. There had been a casserole. He said, 2 weeks after I buried him, I had a print on my porch. I felt the floor of the kitchen go a little soft. He said, I called my cousin in Lance. He told me to come see a man up there, a pastor. I went and saw him. He told me some things. Then I came back here, and I got a new dog from a litter up in Scani, and Maya and I named him Pekka, and the prints stopped. They didn't stop the day I brought Pekka home. They stopped about 6 weeks later, after Pekka started doing the thing at the tree line. After he started his shifts. I said, his shifts. Henrik said, that's what I call it. They have shifts. The dog has shifts. The thing in the trees has shifts. They work it out between them. We're not part of it. We just live here, and we keep the dog, and the dog keeps the agreement, and the agreement keeps us alive. I sat there in my kitchen, and I let that sit in my head for a minute. I said, I'm going to need you to slow down." Henrik laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. He said, "You better come over." I drove to Henrik's cabin that afternoon. It takes 10 minutes by truck on the dirt road. He had coffee on. We sat at his kitchen table where his grandfather had sat in 1926 and where Henrik had sat with his wife for 46 years. And Henrik told me what his cousin in Lens had told him in 2016 and what the pastor up there had told him after. The short version of what Henrik told me is this. There is something that lives in the deep wild country of the Upper Peninsula. It has lived here longer than the iron mines and longer than the loggers and longer than the Ojibwe, who have names for it that they don't share, and longer than the people who came before the Ojibwe and didn't write anything down. It is not a wolf, and it is not a bear, and it is not a misidentified moose, and it is not a hoax. It lives in the deep forest and it stays in the deep forest, but its territory includes the homesteads at the edge of the forest, and it knows when those homesteads are occupied, and it has a kind of relationship with the dogs at those homesteads. Not a friendly relationship, a worked out one. The dogs hold the line at the tree line. The thing stays in the trees. The people stay in the house. Everybody respects everybody else's edge of the field. It has been this way for a long time. When the dog dies, the line is open. That was how Henrik put it. The line is open. Henrik said the thing tests immediately, comes up to the house, walks the perimeter, smells the windows. It is not, he said, trying to attack you. It is checking the new conditions. It is figuring out what the rules are now. The rules are negotiated. If you don't get another dog, the rules collapse. If you do get another dog, the rules reset. There's a window. Henrik said 2 months, maybe 3, to bring in a new dog and get the dog onto duty. After that, the thing decides what you are. Either you are a homestead with a dog at the edge of the field, which is something it understands, or you are a man living alone in a house in the woods with no dog, which is a different category of thing in its understanding. I said, "What's that category?" Henrik looked into his coffee for a while. He said, "Ask the pastor. The pastor's name is Sigurd Voss. He's 81, retired from the Lutheran church in Lens, but he still keeps an office in a back room of the parsonage, and the new pastor doesn't kick him out. Because Voss has been there longer than most of the parishioners have been alive, and because everybody knows Voss keeps the difficult conversations. There are pastors and priests in country like this who have a second specialty that doesn't appear on the church website. Voss is that kind of pastor." Henrik called him from his landline while I sat at the table. Henrik said, "Sigurd, I got a man here. His dog died in March." Sigurd said something I couldn't hear. Henrik said, "Yeah." Henrik hung up. He said, "Drive up tomorrow. Take 41 north. He's expecting you at 10. I drove home in the evening. I went the long way through Champion and Michigami because I didn't want to be at the house yet. I stopped at the gas station in Champion and bought a coffee I didn't need and stood in the parking lot looking at the sky. It was a clear evening, stars coming in over the lake to the north, the Big Dipper sitting where it always sits in April. I thought about how the stars look exactly the same as they have looked for 63 years of my life, and how everything below the stars has changed in the last 3 weeks. I drove home. There was nothing at the porch when I got back. No prints in the yard. The day was quiet. I went inside and I locked the door for the first time in 22 years, which felt absurd because I knew the lock was for my benefit and not for whatever was outside the door. The thing had stepped up onto the porch. A lock was not what was holding it back. What was holding it back, if anything was whatever Henrik had been talking about. The arrangement. I slept maybe 4 hours. I drove up to Lens the next morning. Lens is on the south shore of Keweenaw Bay. It's about an hour north of my place on US 41. The drive takes you up through Michigami and 3 lakes, and then the road bends west and you come over a ridge and you can see the bay opening out, big and gray, with the Keweenaw Peninsula off to the north and the mouth of the bay running out to the open lake beyond. It's beautiful country. It's also old country. There are places along that road where the trees feel like they have been watching the road since before the road was a road, since when the road was a deer trail, since before the deer trail was anything but rock and moss. The parsonage was a yellow clapboard house on a side street 2 blocks off the bay. Voss met me at the door. He was a small man with a thick white beard and very pale blue eyes behind heavy glasses. He shook my hand with both of his hands and led me back through the house to a study that had clearly been a sun porch at one time, and had been converted with bookshelves on every wall and a wood-burning stove in the corner. The shelves were full, and the floor had stacks of books on it that hadn't found shelf space yet. The room smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. He sat me down in a leather chair that had been sat in by a lot of people over a lot of years. He said, "Tell me about your dog." I told him about Boone. I told him about the 11 years of the thing at the tree line. I told him about the print on the porch and the prints under the window and the sound at 2:15 and the conversation with Henrik. Voss listened without saying anything. When I was done, he sat back and folded his hands. He said, "Your neighbor has told you most of what you need to know. I'm here to tell you the rest." Then he reached behind him to a shelf and pulled down a worn leather-bound book and laid it on the desk between us. He said, "Do you know the Book of Enoch?" I said, "I've heard of it. I'm not a church-going man." He said, "That's all right. Most church-going people haven't read it either. It's not in the Bible most Christians read. The early church voted it out in the 4th century. The Ethiopian Orthodox kept it. It survived through them and through some other lines. The Dead Sea Scrolls had copies. It's old. Older than parts of the Old Testament in some scholars' opinion. Listen." He opened the book and read a passage out loud. The passage talked about a group of beings called the Watchers, who came down to the earth in the days before the Great Flood. The Watchers were beings of the heavens. They saw the daughters of men, and they desired them, and they took wives from among them, and they had children with them. The children were called the Nephilim. The Nephilim were giants. They were strong, and they were unnatural, and they consumed everything. They consumed grain, and they consumed cattle, and eventually they consumed people. They sinned, the passage said, against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and devoured one another's flesh and drank the blood. Voss closed the book and set it down. He said, "The Watchers taught humankind things. Different teachers taught different things. One taught metallurgy and the making of weapons. One taught the cutting of roots and the making of medicines. One taught astrology. One taught the enchantments and the writing of incantations. The texts give names for each of them. Some of those names are still in circulation in certain disciplines, and you would be surprised where." He said, "The flood came. The flood was meant to wipe out the Nephilim. The Bible tells you that. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. The phrase, "and also after that," is the part the church doesn't preach about. The flood didn't get them all. I said, "What didn't it get?" Voss said, "In the apocryphal tradition, there are several lineages. The Nephilim themselves, the giants, are one. The Eljo, the second-generation hybrids, are another. And then there's a third category, less well documented, that the Book of Jubilees touches on, and that some of the Sumerian texts predate even Jubilees in describing. The third category is offspring of the Watchers and the beasts of the field. The Watchers, the texts say, did not limit themselves to women. They also coupled with the animals, beasts of the forest, beasts of the field, beasts of the deep. The offspring of those couplings were not giants in the human sense. They were hybrids. They walked between forms. They had the cunning of the higher creatures and the strength of the lower. They could not be classified." He paused. He said, "The Sumerian texts have figures called the Apkallu, sage beings, sometimes shown as fishmen, sometimes shown as men with the heads of birds, sometimes shown as men with the bodies of bulls or lions. The Mesopotamian texts have the Ugalu, lion men, the Ulikumi, stone men. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of our era, described peoples in the Far East with the heads of dogs, cynocephaly. The traveler Marco Polo wrote about them when he went to Asia. The early Eastern Church had a saint, Saint Christopher, who, in some Eastern traditions, is depicted with the head of a dog, because they took the cynocephaly to be a real people that some of them had converted to the faith. The Greek geographers wrote of them. The Hindu Mahabharata mentions dog-headed beings in the wild places. Across cultures, across continents, across centuries, you find the same figure described, a being that walks upright, that has the proportions of a man stretched longer, that has the head of a dog or a wolf, that lives in the wild places at the edge of the human world. He looked at me over his glasses. He said, "The church does not officially have a position on what these accounts describe. Off the record, some of us who have spent our lives in country like this have a position. We think the accounts describe a real thing, a category of being that the flood was meant to wipe out and didn't. because some of them lived too deep in the forests and the mountains and the caves to be drowned by water. The Watchers and their hybrids retreated into the wild places when the world was remade. They have been there ever since. The Book of Jubilees says the spirits of the dead Nephilim continued to walk the earth after the flood. The apocryphal tradition is consistent that something survived. The deep forests of North America are some of the deepest in the world. There is country up here that no human foot has touched since the glaciers retreated. There is country in the McCormick that has not been logged. There are caves in the Hurons that have not been mapped. There are places. I sat in the leather chair and tried to take this in. The wood-burning stove ticked. Voss reached behind him again and pulled down a different book, a smaller one, hand-bound in brown leather. He opened it. It was a notebook. His handwriting, careful and small, filled the pages. He said, "I want to tell you about a man I knew. His name was Daniel Loonsfoot. He was an elder in the Keweenaw Bay Indian community over in Zeba. He died in 2014 at 91 years old. I knew him for 32 of those years. We came at the same thing from different doors, and we used to compare notes, in the way two old men do when they trust each other." Voss looked down at the notebook. He said, "Daniel told me his people have words for what you have on your property. He did not give me the words. He said the words have power, and you don't say them lightly, and he wasn't going to write them down for me to put in a book. I respected that. But he told me about them in other ways. He said, the Anishinaabe tradition has more than one kind of being in the deep forest. There is the Wendigo, which most people have heard of. The Wendigo is connected to starvation, to cannibalism, to a hunger that consumes the person from inside. The Wendigo is its own thing, and it is not what you have. What you have is something else. Daniel called them, in English, the dog walkers. He said his grandfather had called them by the name he wouldn't give me, but in English the dog walkers was as close as he could get. He said, Daniel told me the dog walkers were here before the Anishinaabe came to this country. They were here when the first people came up the lakes after the ice. The first people made an arrangement with them. The arrangement was that the people would keep dogs, and the dogs would stand at the line, and the dog walkers would not cross. The dogs were a third party. The dogs were neither people nor dog walkers. They were the bridge between the two. He said, Daniel said his people, when they had a death of a dog, would go through certain rites before the next dog came. The rites were to ensure the agreement continued without break. He didn't give me the rites either, but he said the rites existed, and they had existed for many generations, and the families that observed them did not have the trouble that the families that didn't observe them had. Voss closed the notebook. He said, I tell you this for two reasons. The first is that you are not the first man to be sitting in this chair hearing this story. The second is that the Ojibwe tradition and the Hebrew tradition I read to you from the Book of Enoch are talking about the same thing. They are not the same tradition. They did not influence each other. They are an ocean and 1,000 miles of forest and 3,000 years apart from each other. And they agree. Two traditions, completely unconnected, describing a being that walks upright, has the head of a dog or a wolf, lives in the deep forest, makes arrangements with humans through dogs. When two traditions that have never met agree on a description that specific, you have to take the description seriously. The world is not coordinated to that extent by accident. Something is being described, something real. He set the notebook back on the shelf. He said, Daniel told me one more thing before he died. He said the dog walkers had been watching what was happening to the country, the logging, the mining, the pipelines, the cell towers going up on the ridges. He said the dog walkers were patient, but they were not infinite. He said one day the country would not be deep enough anymore, and the arrangement would have to change. He said he was glad he would not be here to see what came after. He said it was not his job to see it. It was the job of the people who would still be living here when it happened. He looked at me. He said, you might be one of those people. I am not. I'm 81. The people who are 40 now, the people who are 30, the people who haven't been born yet, they're going to inherit whatever the change looks like. The dogs will tell them what to do. The dogs always tell us. The dogs have not forgotten the agreement. We are the ones who forget. The dogs are the line of memory. He said, I have spent 50 years up here. I have talked to a lot of people who have had the kind of experience you are having. I have buried dogs that died of old age and watched the families bring in new dogs in time, and the families are still on their land. And I have buried dogs that died and watched the families decide not to bring in new dogs because they thought they were being superstitious. And 3 out of 5 of those families have left the country either by choice or not by choice. The not by choice ones don't always leave alive. I said, "You're saying I'm in danger." He said, "I'm saying you're in negotiation. You are at the part of the negotiation where the other party is testing what you intend to do." The visit on the porch was a test. The visit under the window was a test. The vocalization was a clarification. The thing is asking you what your status is. The thing is not stupid. It has been doing this for a very long time. It knows the difference between a homestead with a guardian and a homestead without one. It is waiting for you to declare which one you are. I said, "What happens if I don't declare in time?" Voss said, "The literature on that is unclear. The local experience is less unclear. The local experience is that people who do not declare get reclassified. The thing decides they are not a homestead. They are something else. Something it has been doing to humans in this country for longer than there have been humans recording what it does. Roger, from up the road from you. Did Henrik tell you about Roger?" I said, "Yes." Voss said, "Roger didn't have a dog." I sat in the chair for a long time. The stove ticked. Voss didn't push me. He was a man who had given this talk before. He knew the part where it landed and the part where it took a minute. He said, "The good news, if you can call it that, is that the arrangement is real and the arrangement holds. You hold up your end, the thing holds up its end. It has been doing so on your property for 22 years because you had Boone. It will do so again if you get another dog and the thing work out their own terms. They do that themselves. We don't understand the part where they do that. We just see that it happens." He said, "The other piece of good news is that the thing is in its way honorable. It does not break the arrangement once it's made. There are stories in the Ojibwe communities up here, stories I have heard from people I trust, of these beings keeping their side of treaties that go back many generations. They are not friendly. They are not safe. They are not your allies. But they are reliable. They are, in some sense, I am uncomfortable using the word for, lawful." I said, "What kind of dog?" Voss laughed a little. He said, "Anything that does the job. Hound, shepherd, big mutt. Not a small dog. Small dogs don't have the standing for the negotiation. You want a dog that can stand at the tree line at 30 pounds minimum, and ideally more. The dog has to mean it. The thing reads the dog the way you would read a person's posture. A dog that is committed is what you need." I said, "Where do I get a dog like that on short notice?" He said, "Talk to Henrik. He knows people. There is always a litter somewhere up here. You won't find one in a shelter in time. You'll find one through somebody who knows somebody. Pay what they ask, don't quibble." I sat for a while longer. Voss let me sit. Eventually he poured me a small glass of brandy from a bottle in a drawer, and I drank it, and the warmth went down into my chest and steadied me a little. I said, "Can I ask you one more thing?" He said, "Of course." I said, "Do you believe what you've told me?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I believe it the way I believe in love and grief, both of which I have also worked with for 50 years. I have seen the effects. I cannot show you the cause in a way that would satisfy a court of law. The effects, though, I have seen. I would not have stayed in this work this long if I had not seen them." I left around noon. He walked me to the truck. At the truck, he put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Get the dog. Don't wait. And listen to the dog. The dog will tell you what to do next. The dogs have been doing this longer than we have. We are the new ones at this." I drove back south on US 41. The bay was on my right for the first part of the drive, and then the road bent inland and the trees closed in and the bay went away behind me. I thought about a lot of things on that drive. I thought about Boone. I thought about Roger. I thought about the Watchers descending on Mount Hermon in a story written down before there was a New Testament. I thought about cynocephaly. I thought about the fact that on the front of my own porch, at the property I had bought because I couldn't stand to be in a city after my wife died, there was a print of a four-toed foot the size of a dinner plate with claws. I thought about how nothing in my life had prepared me for the idea that the thing in the trees was not a freak occurrence or a misidentification or a wild story. It was a stable category of being that had been operating in these forests since before Greek geographers wrote about it. It had a job. It had a relationship with dogs and with men. It had, in a sense, Voss was uncomfortable with, lawfulness. And it was, right now, waiting for me to declare what I intended to be on the 80 acres outside Republic, Michigan. I got home around 2 in the afternoon. The light coming through the kitchen window was the flat, clean April light that doesn't have any kindness in it. I sat at the table and called Henrik again from the landline because cell reception out here will sometimes drop the call halfway through, and I didn't want that. I told him what Voss had said. I asked him about a dog. Henrik said, "Give me an hour." He hung up. He called back in 40 minutes. He said, "There's a litter up in Watton, Walker hounds, 2 months old, 3 males still available. The woman is a friend of my late wife's sister. She's expecting your call. Her name is Annika Niemi." He gave me the number. I called Annika. She had a kind voice and didn't ask me a lot of questions. She said the pups were ready to leave the mother. She said she had 3 left because the rest had gone to working homes, and these 3 would also go to working homes or not go at all. I said I was a working home. She said Henrik told her. She said she'd see me tomorrow morning. I sat at the table for a while after I hung up. The house was very quiet. I made myself a sandwich and I ate half of it, and I gave the other half to Boone before I remembered that there was no Boone, and I sat at the table holding half a sandwich and crying without making any sound for about 10 minutes. That night was the worst one. I want to tell you about it carefully because I have thought about it a lot since. I went to bed at around 10:30. I had the porch light on. I had the bedroom window cracked because the wood stove was running, and the room gets too warm if I don't. I lay in the dark and I waited. It came at 12:42. I know because I looked at the clock. The vocalization first, not far. Maybe just inside the tree line. The same long syllable, dropped 2 octaves below where a throat should reach, with that wet quality I had noticed before, a tongue and a mouth working at it. 5 seconds, maybe 6. Then the steps. The steps came across the field. They were slow, and they were heavy, and they were deliberate. They did not have the irregularity of an animal walking. They had the rhythm of something taking measured strides, the way a man paces out a property line. They came across the field from south to north, and they stopped at the corner of the porch. I lay in the bed. I did not move. I do not know why I did not move. Something in my body told me to be very still, and I was very still. The thing walked the length of the porch. I could hear the boards. I had never noticed before how clearly the porch boards would tell me about something on them. The 3rd board from the door creaked. It has creaked since I bought the house. I had a vague intention of fixing it for 22 years and never had. That 3rd board creaked at 12:45 and a half, and I lay in the dark and listened to it. The steps stopped outside the bedroom window. The window was cracked maybe 4 inches. I heard it breathe. I want to be precise about this. The breathing was deep and slow. The inhale was around 3 seconds. The exhale was about 4. There was a slight rasp in the exhale, not a wheeze, just a texture, like a man with a cold breathing through his nose. The breath was warm. I could smell it. I want to tell you what it smelled like, and I have struggled with this for weeks because there isn't a real comparison. The closest I can get is wet dog and torn wood, and a third thing that wasn't either of those. A chemical sweetness like burned sugar, but lower, fainter. Something I have only ever smelled in deep caves where the air doesn't move. It was breathing into my bedroom from a distance of about 4 feet, separated from me by maybe an inch of glass and a 4-inch gap of open window. I could see the silhouette through the curtain. The curtain is a thin cotton thing that doesn't really block light. The porch light was on. The silhouette filled the entire window from sill to top sash and continued above the top of the window. Whatever was standing outside my bedroom was tall enough that I could only see its lower half in the window's frame. The head was somewhere above the window. The shoulders were at the top of the glass. It breathed in. It breathed out. It breathed in. It breathed out. There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of this, when the breathing paused and a different sound came. A faint click, then another, then a third. I have thought about that sound for months, and I think what I was hearing was claws on the porch boards as the thing shifted its weight. The way a big dog shifts on hardwood. You hear the claws because they don't retract the way a cat's do. The clicks moved a few inches and stopped. The breathing resumed in the same rhythm at the same position. I want to tell you about what was happening in my head during this. I want to be honest about it. The first thing was fear, cold, deep body fear, the kind that locks you down at the cellular level and makes your hands feel far away from your body. The second thing was a kind of grief, because Boone was not at the foot of the bed, where he would have been doing the rumble in his chest and standing the thing off, and the absence of him was as real in that moment as the presence of the thing at the window. The third thing was something I did not expect, and that I do not fully understand even now. The third thing was a kind of recognition. The body of the thing at the window was registering, through the breath and the size and the smell and the silhouette and the click of the claws on the boards, as a category that some old part of me already knew. I think this is what Voss was talking about when he said the dogs know without being taught. I think there is something in human beings that knows too, something that has been knowing since the first man pulled the first burning stick out of the first fire to push back at the first shape at the edge of the light. We are descended from people who lived next to these things. We have not forgotten what they are. We have only forgotten that we knew. I do not know how long the breathing lasted. I lost track of time. It might have been 3 minutes. It might have been 10. I lay in the bed with my eyes open, looking at the silhouette, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I reached under the pillow where I had put Boone's collar that morning because I had been holding it before bed. I took the collar out. I held it in my hand on top of the blanket where the smell of the leather and the lingering dog smell on it could be in the air. I lay there with Boone's collar in my hand and I listened to the thing breathe outside my window. The breathing changed. It got slower. Then there was a pause, a long pause, a held breath, then a long sniff, loud, slow, deliberate. The thing was smelling. It was smelling the collar. It was smelling Boone. I do not know what it knew about Boone. I do not know if it recognized the specific dog whose smell it had been in dialogue with for 11 years, or if it just recognized that there was a dog smell, or if dogs to it are all interchangeable in some category of thing way. I cannot tell you what it knew. What I can tell you is that after the long sniff, it took one more breath, and then it took a step back, and then it was gone. It walked back across the field, slow, measured, the same 8-foot strides. It went south, back to the tree line, and into the trees, and the field was empty again. I lay in bed for 2 more hours before I could move. In the morning, there were tracks all along the porch. 3 sets coming, going around to the bedroom window, standing at the window, and 3 sets going back. The tracks at the window were close together, 2 prints side by side. It had stood there with its feet together, like a man at attention. I drove up to Watton at 9 to get the puppy. Annika Nemi's place is way back off a forest road, a little cedar-sided house with kennels in the back. The mother dog, a big walker bitch named Sima, was lying in the sun on the porch when I pulled up. The 3 remaining pups were tumbling around her. They were all males, tricolor, white with black saddles and brown on the muzzles, ears that hadn't quite figured out which way to fall yet. Annika came out and shook my hand and squatted down next to the pups. She said, "You want to pick him or you want him to pick you?" I said, "I'll let him pick." I sat down in the dirt and the 3 pups came over and sniffed at my pant cuffs. 2 of them lost interest and wandered back to their mother. The 3rd one sat down on my boot and looked up at me. He had brown eyebrow markings that gave him a serious expression. He looked at me like he was assessing something. Then he stretched out and chewed on the lace of my boot, and I knew. Annika watched him pick me. She didn't say anything for a minute. Then she said, "That one was the last one to nurse every time." He waited. The others would fight, and he would stand back, and then he would go in last, and take what was left. "He's a thinker." "You need a thinker, yeah?" I said. "I need a thinker." She gave me his papers. She gave me a small bag of the food the pups had been on. She gave me a folded blanket from the whelping box that smelled like Sima and her milk. She said, "Keep that with him in his crate the first week. He'll cry less." I paid her in cash, what she asked, no quibbling. I put the pup on the bench seat of the truck next to me with the blanket under him, and I drove home. He cried a little on the drive. I put my hand on him, and he settled. He smelled like puppy and milk and the cedar shavings from the whelping box. He was warm against my hand. He weighed maybe 10 pounds. I named him Job. I didn't plan to. I had thought about it some on the drive up, but I hadn't decided. When I brought him into the kitchen and set him down on the floor, he looked up at me from the linoleum with that serious eyebrow expression, and I just said it out loud. Job, like the book of the Bible, because somebody who had been put through what I had been put through in the last 3 weeks would have to be a Job to think there was any meaning in any of it, and because I needed a name for the dog who was going to stand at the tree line for me from now on, and because Voss had given me a kind of religious framework whether I wanted it or not, and because of all the names I could think of, Job was the one that fit. The next 2 weeks were the puppy weeks. Job slept in his crate next to my bed. He cried the first 2 nights. The third night he didn't. He started learning the property the way Boone had learned the property, where the food and water bowls were, which corner of the yard was for going. He chewed everything he could reach. He chewed Boone's collar once, and I took it away from him gently and put it on a higher hook. He couldn't reach it. The thing did not come back to the house in those 2 weeks. I want to be clear about that. After the night at the window, the thing took a step back, and it did not return to the porch, and it did not return to the window. I do not know what was happening in its understanding during those 2 weeks. I think it knew. I think the smell of a new dog in the house, the puppy crying at night, the dog food on the porch, the changing pattern of activity in the yard, all of it was information. I think it was watching. I think it was waiting to see what I had brought home. On the 15th night, Job did the thing. He was 4 months old. He had grown to about 28 pounds. He was still a puppy. He still chewed on my boots and tripped over his own feet and tried to climb into my lap when I sat on the porch. But on that 15th night, around dusk, he was on the porch with me, and he froze. I want to describe it exactly because I have thought about this moment a lot. He didn't growl at first. He just stopped moving. His head came up. His ears went forward and then back, flat against his skull. His tail, which was always wagging, went very slowly down and stiff. His weight shifted onto his front legs. He stared at the tree line. I sat very still. I had been waiting for this, and dreading it at the same time. I had wondered if a puppy this young could do what Boone had done. I had wondered if the agreement was inherited, or if it was made fresh each time, dog to thing. Job's lips peeled back from his teeth, slow, almost gentle. The hackles came up along his spine in a ridge from his neck to his tail. He took one step forward toward the tree line, then another. Then he stopped, and he lowered his head, and a low rumble started in his chest that I felt in the boards of the porch through my boots before I heard it with my ears. He didn't bark. He did not bark. He had barked at everything in his life up to that moment. The mailman, the deer, his own water bowl. But on the night that he met the thing at the tree line, he did not bark, because barking was not what the moment called for. Barking would have been a small thing. He was doing a big thing. I watched him do it. I watched him stand on my porch and stare at the tree line and make a sound that was not a bark. That was the same low-chest rumble Boone had made for 11 years. And I understood that Voss was right. The dogs know. They know without being taught. There is something in the deep wiring of a working dog, or in the deep wiring of certain dogs and not others, that recognizes the thing in the trees and recognizes the job. Annika had said Job was a thinker. I think she saw it in him at 6 weeks old. I think dogs like Job have been thinkers since the first dog stood between the first man and the first thing at the edge of the firelight, 10,000 years ago, 20,000, longer. There is a lineage. The watchers have a lineage and the dogs have a lineage, and the two lineages have been negotiating with each other for as long as there has been a forest. After about 4 minutes, the thing in the trees left. I knew it left because Job's hackles dropped all at once, and his lips came back over his teeth, and he sat down next to me and panted and looked up at me with that loose-tongue, happy look that I had thought I would never see on a dog again. And tears came down my face because I knew right then that I was going to be all right, and the property was going to be all right, and the line was going to hold. The next morning I went out to the tree line. Tracks, the same four-toed prints. They came up to a point about 10 yards inside the tree line, stopped there, and went back. The thing had not crossed into the field. It had come up to the line, looked across at Job on the porch, taken the measure of the new dog, and gone back into the trees. The arrangement had been remade. The shifts had been worked out. Job's shift had started. I want to tell you about a few things that have happened since, because I do not want to leave you with the idea that everything became simple. About 2 weeks after that first reaction, Job did the thing again, and this time, when the thing in the trees left, it left a kind of sign in the field. I want to describe this carefully. It was a flat patch of grass about 20 yards inside the tree line where the field grass had been pressed down in a circle. Not stomped, pressed, like something heavy had stood on it for a long time and then stepped off. The circle was about 6 feet across. In the center of the circle, on a flat stone, there was a piece of bone. I picked it up. It was a deer bone, a leg. It was clean. It had been gnawed at one end, methodically, the way a person eats meat off a leg of lamb, not the way a coyote tears at a carcass. The bone had been left on the stone deliberately. I took the bone inside, and I asked Henrik about it on the phone the next day. Henrik was quiet for a while. Then he said, "That's a gift." I said, "A gift." He said, "The dog held the line." The thing was, in its way, acknowledging it. Maya used to put out food at the back fence twice a year, Christmas and midsummer, just a bowl of beef trim and a few apples. They never disappeared all the way. Some would go, some would be left. We never saw it happen. We never knew what to call it. Maya called it, leaving something for the woods. She didn't talk about it more than that. He paused. He said, "I haven't put out anything since Maya passed. I don't know why. I think I forgot. I left the deer bone in the back of the woodshed in a wooden box. I don't know what to do with it yet. I have not been able to bring myself to throw it out. It is sitting in the woodshed in the box, and one of these days I will figure out what to do with it. Henrik has not started leaving things out at midsummer again, and I have not asked him to. The first snow came on November 5th, 3 inches overnight. Job came out the back door in the morning and stopped on the porch and looked at the white covering everything and tilted his head with that serious eyebrow expression. Then he went down the steps and put his nose in it and sneezed and ran in a circle, and I laughed out loud, which I had not done in a while. That afternoon, I taught him to track. He was a puppy still, and his nose had been telling him about the world for months, but I had not put him on a trail. I walked out to the back field while he was inside, and then circled back through the woods and came back at the cabin from a different direction. When I let him out, he found my track at the back door in about 3 seconds and worked it across the field and into the trees and back. He was good. He was going to be a serious dog. The night after the first snow, he did the thing again. The tree line showing up bright white against the dark of the trees, and Job at the porch railing, with his head down and the hackles up. I came out and stood next to him. There were no tracks in the snow yet at the tree line. Whatever was there had not come out of the trees, but it was at the trees, and Job knew. I want to tell you about a small thing that happened that night. After about 3 minutes of Job holding the line, he turned his head slowly and looked up at me. His eyes met mine. It was not the look a dog gives when it wants food or attention, or to be let inside. It was a look I had seen before, on Boone, exactly twice in 14 years. It was the look that says, "I see you, you see me, we are doing this together, the line is between the trees and this porch, and you and I are on the porch." It was the look that says, "You are the one I am doing this for. You are the reason for the work." I put my hand on his head, and he turned back to the tree line. The thing left a few minutes later. In the morning, there were tracks in the snow about 30 yards inside the tree line. They did not come out into the field. They walked along the line and went back into the trees. I think about that look a lot. The dog telling me, with his whole posture, that he understands what we are doing, that he has chosen to do it, that he is doing it with me, not for me, not under my command, but in partnership with me. Dogs like Job choose their people. The choice is real, and the choice is binding. The thing in the trees may have an agreement with the property and with the dog, but the dog has a separate agreement with me, and that one is older than the Anishinaabe and older than the Hebrews who wrote down the Book of Enoch. That one is the original agreement, the one that started in the dark outside the first fire when one wolf decided it would rather sit with the people than with its pack, and one person decided that wolf was welcome, and the world got a little warmer because of it. Pastor Voss called me about a month after I came home from Lens. He just wanted to check in. I told him about Job and about the bone on the stone. He listened. He didn't sound surprised. He said, "That's good. That's the way it's supposed to go." The dog finds his shift. The arrangement holds. Sometimes there is a gesture. The gesture is real. It is the closest thing to a covenant that you will get from a thing that doesn't share your language. I asked him if he wanted to come down sometime and see the property. He said, "No, son. I don't go out into country like yours anymore. I am 81 years old and my back doesn't take long drives, but I'll be on the phone if you need me. And if anything changes, you call me. The thing is reliable, but the world is not. Conditions can change. People do things that disturb arrangements. People always have. If anything changes, you call." I said I would. I hung up and I sat at the kitchen table with Job sleeping under it on a piece of folded denim, and I thought about how strange my life had become in 7 weeks. I had buried my dog of 14 and a half years. I had been visited at my window by a thing whose closest documented relatives are described in a book the early church voted out of the Bible in the 4th century. I had bought a puppy and named him Job. I had been given a deer bone on a stone. I had a phone number for a Lutheran pastor in Lens who had given me the framework for understanding all of this, and who had also gently reminded me that none of it would have happened if I hadn't had a working dog at the tree line for 11 years. Job is 6 months old now. He has grown into himself. He is 60 pounds, and he is still growing. His ears have decided to fall forward the way a hound's ears are supposed to fall, and he has the brown eyebrow markings still, and he has a serious face that softens into a soft face when he sees me. He does the thing at the tree line maybe twice a month. He does not bark when he does it. He lowers his head and he stares, and the rumble starts in his chest, and the porch boards hum under my boots. After he relaxes, he comes over and sits next to me and puts his head under my hand for me to scratch his ears. And we sit there in the dark and we watch the trees together. I think about Boone every day. I have not stopped. Voss told me on the phone once that the grief of a dog like that is a real grief and it doesn't shrink. It just makes room for other things. He said that was a Lutheran way of putting it. He said the Ojibwe up here have other ways of putting it. He said, they're all the same idea. I want to tell you one more thing before I stop. It's the part that has stayed with me the most. About 2 weeks ago, in early October, I was sitting on the porch in the evening with Job at my feet, and the thing in the trees did something it had never done in 11 years with Boone. It vocalized. From the tree line, just inside it, close enough that I could hear it clear, that long, low syllable, that wet quality, 4 seconds of sound. Job's hackles came up. He started to stand. The vocalization stopped. There was a pause. Then, very softly, a different sound, higher, shorter, almost like a sigh. Job's hackles dropped. He sat back down at my feet. He didn't look at the tree line anymore. He looked up at me. His eyes were calm. I do not know what to do with that. I have replayed it many times. Voss said when I told him about it that it might have been a greeting, a formal one, a nod of the head between two parties who have come to understand each other. He said he had heard of it once before, from an old man up in Baraga who had lived on the same land his whole life and had been on the 3rd dog of a lineage that had served the same property. He said it was rare. He said it was a good sign. He said it meant the arrangement was deeper than just the dog. He said the property itself had become known to the thing. The place, not just the dog. The place was now part of the agreement. I don't know what to do with that either. I am 63 years old, and the idea that the 80 acres I bought after my wife died has, over 22 years and through one dog and into the second one, become party to an arrangement with a being whose documented antecedents go back to a book older than the New Testament is a lot to sit with. I sit with it most evenings on the porch. Job sits with me. The trees stand the way trees stand. The light goes down. The stars come up. I am still here. The property is still here. The dog is still here. Boone is still under the white pine at the south edge of the field. I go down to the stone sometimes, and I sit next to it. Last week I noticed something I had not noticed before. There were 2 prints on the ground near the stone. Not on top of the stone, near it, about a foot away, 4-toed, side by side. Whatever was standing there had stood facing the grave, feet together, the same way it had stood at my bedroom window 7 months ago. It had stood there, and then it had stepped back, and it had gone, and it had not disturbed anything. I think it was paying its respects. I know how that sounds. I cried for a long time that afternoon. Job came down and sat next to me. The trees stood, the light slanted in long. The hour was gold. I am still here. I am keeping the dog alive. I am holding up my end. The agreement is intact. If you are reading this, and you live at the edge of country like mine, anywhere in the deep forests of the world, in the UP, in the Adirondacks, in the North Cascades, in the Smokies, in the Olympic, in the Ozarks, in the long, lonely woods of central and eastern Canada, in the British Columbia interior, in the highlands of Maine, in places where the forest is older than human memory, and where the deep night is darker than people who live in cities will ever understand. Listen to me. Keep a dog. Keep a real one. A working one, not a small one, not a yard dog, a real one. A dog with a chest you can feel in the floorboards when it growls. A dog with the kind of seriousness that you can see in its eyes the first time it stares at the tree line, and the hackles come up, and the lips peel back from its teeth, and it doesn't bark. When that dog dies, do not wait. Get the next one. Bring it home before the line opens. Hold up your end. Sit on your porch in the evenings. Watch the gold hour come down over the field. Let your dog sit next to you. Let your dog do its job. There are things in the deep woods of this continent that have been there longer than any of us. They have a job too. As long as your dog and their thing have an understanding, you and your house and your life are not part of the negotiation. You are the homestead at the edge of the field. You are the lit window across the dark trees. The dog stands between you and what stands between worlds. That is what dogs were made for. That is what they have been doing for 10,000 years. Maybe 20, maybe longer. The Book of Enoch is older than people think, and the dogs are older than the Book of Enoch. I'll leave it there. I just wanted somebody to know. I have been carrying this for a long time, and Henrik is going to die one of these years, and Voss is going to die one of these years, and after they're gone, I'll be one of the few who knows. And I wanted to put it down somewhere, wanted somebody to hear it. Job is asleep at my feet right now. The porch light is off, the stars are bright. There's no moon, the tree line is dark. Somewhere out there, on its own shift, is something that is, in its way, watching the same stars. I'm going inside now. I'll make coffee in the morning. I'll come back out to the porch. Job will run his loop. The day will go. That's how the agreement holds. That's how you stay alive out here. That's how my dog saved my life.